Chapter 11. Mr. Ono raised his dinner plate to his face and studied the puddle of steaming frijoles curiously. His nostrils sniffed its aroma. "I know this smell," he said as he raked a chopstick across the plate and sucked on the end. He closed his eyes and smiled as the steam rose from the dish. "I know this taste," he concluded, opening his eyes and nodding his head in approval. "How can you know?" Mrs. Ono said. "I just know," he answered. Mrs. Ono looked at their guest, the Inabas, and raised her glass of beer in salute to them. They, in turn, saluted the Onos. She took a tiny bird-like sip and said, "My husband thinks that he likes foreign food. He just likes noodles and fish. He's not very adventurous." "I like all kinds of food," Mr. Ono argued. "Noodles and fish," Mrs. Ono countered playfully. "No, I'm an international eater. Don't you recall the time I tried snake when I was in Thailand?" "I tried it, but I felt guilty because sometimes I feel slippery as a snake. How could I eat my own kind?" He laughed at his joke and took a drink of his beer, smacking his lips. Mrs. Ono rolled her eyes and got up to check the boys in the kitchen. For the past 3 hours, this is an investment of time, my friends, Lincoln and Tony had been preparing the food. They'd cooked the beans and smashed them into frijoles. They chopped chilies, onions, and tomatoes for salsa. They squeezed dough and rolled it into odd-shaped tortillas, and they cooked ground beef. Now, they brought the rest of the food to the table and joined their families. "We are honored that you invited us," Mr. Inaba said to the Onos, smiling so that the gold crowns of his teeth showed. "We have heard so much about your family." "We have heard about your family as well," Mrs. Ono said. Mrs. Inaba looked at Tony. "Tony-kun is a hard-working boy." Tony raised his hands and showed them his dime-sized blisters. Along with the Inaba's son, Toshi, he had worked their patch of cabbages and radishes into healthy vegetables that they would later sell on the roadside. "He also taught our son valuable American words." "Such as?" Mr. Ono asked, trying some more frijoles. Mr. Inaba thought and then said, "Orale esse." He turned to Tony, who was headed back to the kitchen to fry more tortillas, and yelled, "Orale esse, Simon que si papi." Tony called back as he turned over one of his homemade tortillas. The tortilla puffed up like a blimp. Tony stabbed it with a fork and the hot air sighed out. "Lincoln is a nice boy too," Mrs. Ono volunteered. "He is practicing Kempo." "Kempo?" Mr. Inaba looked at Lincoln, sizing him up, and asked, "Who is your teacher?" "Oyama-sensei," Lincoln said. "He's bad." "Bad?" repeated Mr. Inaba. "But I thought she was an excellent teacher." "Bad means good," Mrs. Ono said. "It is an American expression. Very valuable word." Tony returned from the kitchen with a dish towel of warm tortillas. "Here, try another before they get cold." Lincoln took the dish towel from Tony and offered the stack of tortillas to Mr. Inaba, who was sampling his frijoles. When Mr. Inaba bit into the tortilla, it crackled like a Dorito. He grunted and commented, "Interesting food." Lincoln looked at Tony, and Tony looked back. Lincoln muttered, "Oh, we messed up. These tortillas are hard as rocks." "Harder," Tony whispered back. "And the avocados ain't any good either. $5 a piece, man. And they're mostly black as the soul of my cousin Pete. And that dude's in jail." "No wonder you two are so strong," Mrs. Inaba said, attempting a compliment. "The food is so hard." Even the frijoles were undercooked, so that they had to mash them with their teeth before they could be swallowed. They washed them down with tea or beer, and the salsa was more like ketchup than a fiery sauce that Lincoln and Tony's mothers concocted every Saturday morning. But the families tried it all, and they smiled between bites, drank their beer and tea, and made small talk about the weather, the traffic, and the new emperor. After dinner, the four boys went to Mitsu's room, where they played Nintendo and ate nigirimeshi, rice balls, because they were still hungry. Tony and Lincoln punched each other in the arm. "We messed up," Tony said, a grain of rice clinging to his chin. "You got rice on your face," Lincoln said. He turned to the Japanese boys. "Mexican food really is good. If we knew how to cook, you'd die in paradise. My mom makes the best enchiladas." "We believe you," said Toshi. "If we had to make Japanese food, we would make it terrible also." "I'm sure you guys could do better," Tony said. "No, we would starve," Mitsu said. Toshi nodded in agreement. Mitsu suggested that they go and get ice cream cones, so they left through the window, stepping carefully over the garden for fear that they would trample a tomato. Then they would really be in trouble. When they saw that they had been gone nearly an hour, they raced home, knots of hunger twisting in their stomachs, and they arrived just in time. The adults were frying a fish that was nearly as large as a guitar. A new pot of rice was steaming, and the tea was simmering, and icy bottles of ramen were waiting. Then at 9:45 at night, with the moon hanging like a sickle in the sky, the fiesta really began.